I'm Aundrea Cline-Thomas. The economic hardship caused by the pandemic has forced many people to make really tough decisions about the bare necessities on how to get by. Now, when it comes to rent, Governor Cuomo just extended the eviction moratorium to January 1st, 2021, but that does not mean evictions have stopped altogether. And we have two guests joining us today from Catholic Charities to talk about rent relief programs that are available all across the city and what your rights are as a tenant. Larissa Story is the home-based director, and Antonio Garcia is the director of the Community Services Eviction Prevention Program. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
So let's first start with the basics. The governor extended the eviction moratorium to January 1, 2021. What does that even mean? Who qualifies?
It covers residential tenants, but they must have been affected by the pandemic. And the language that the order uses is people who suffer financial hardship during the pandemic.
So you have to have a hardship that's directly related to COVID.
If the landlord tries to evict you and he motions for a warrant of eviction, you can use that executive order as a defense in housing court. So in order to bring it up as a defense in housing court, you need to prove to the judge that you suffer financial hardship during the pandemic. However, the order also covers any arrears that accrued prior to March 7th, which is the covered period of the Tenant Safe Harbor Act. So those folks can also raise a defense.
Fantastic. So Larissa, tell me about Catholic Charities. I know that you have been helping people with their rent. You have a rent relief program, paying $7,000, $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 to help people with back rent. Tell us about that program.
Even though we're here representing Catholic Charities, it's a program that's managed by several different agencies. So no matter where you're located, in what zip code in New York City, in any of the 5 boroughs, you're actually covered by a home-based location. And our responsibility is to prevent eviction, to prevent shelter entry, to prevent people from being taken to housing court or from being evicted thereafter.
When you pay for rent relief, you're paying directly to the landlord, correct? You're not giving the money to the tenant.
Yes, and that's why it's important to have the documents that we need, like proof of address, a lease, a letter from the landlord contact information, because we do verify this information before paying out. Sometimes we have to go to other agencies, and the other agencies have different criteria in order for them to pay out. They may need a deed or a W-9, and once we have landlord information, we're able to do that advocacy and running around on behalf of the client.
Are there income requirements?
It does go by family size, according to families of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it keeps going up. We'll calculate the income. We take into account employment, SSI. We look up and see if they're receiving benefits. We'll calculate it and determine eligibility at that point.
And I know that with a lot of resources that have been put out there for COVID, it has excluded those who are undocumented. But now there's a fund for people who are undocumented. Talk about that.
We've seen a pattern where there are a large group of undocumented people who fell into arrears due to COVID. They might have been scared to even fall into arrears prior to this because they didn't want to deal with any legal issues, but were left with no options after March when they lost their jobs. So what we previously weren't able to assist them as of, July 27th? Antonio, you can correct me on the date. We've been able to assess for assistance. Now, there are also income criteria for this program. It's a little bit higher than our normal program. But again, once they come in, once they make an appointment and they're assessed, we determine eligibility. And we might even find that they're eligible for other programs that are not this called FASTN program. They might be eligible for our regular home-based services, and they weren't even aware of this. So it's our job here to screen them to see the best course of assistance for them.
You know, Antonio, just in talking to a lot of people, when the federal unemployment supplemental, they were getting the extra $600 a week. A lot of people said that really helped them kind of just break even. And now with that gone, a lot more people are stressed and there's no sign of it returning. So if people are falling into where they normally have been able to pay their rent, this is a very new space for them to be in. What types of conversations should they be having with their landlords right now if they're unable to pay?
Yes, we encourage people who, especially those who aren't above income and are not eligible for our programs, they can always negotiate with the landlord, and hopefully the landlord will understand and they can establish some sort of forbearance program or lower the rent. So that's always recommendable. Tenants should always speak to their landlords and try to reach an agreement. But it's important to remember that all residential tenants in New York City that have been affected or suffer financial hardship during the pandemic, they cannot be evicted at least until January the 1st.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. If your landlord is threatening eviction, what rights do you have?
Nobody in New York City, no residential tenant in New York City can be evicted without due process. And due process essentially means that the landlord is required to give you notice, and then he is also required to start a housing court case for non-payment. A judge is the only person in New York City authorized to issue a warrant of eviction.
Does Catholic Charities or do any other home-based programs provide legal assistance if a landlord, is wrongfully threatening a tenant?
The most common way of them doing that is by locking the tenant out of the apartment. If that happens, there are procedures that the New York City Police Department has in place to restore the tenant to possession. So we always recommend tenants to go to their nearest precinct and speak to the desk sergeant. They understand what those procedures are. And believe me, the New York City Police will force the landlord to open the door and allow the family or the individual to the apartment.
They may think they're being evicted when a court action hasn't even been started. So we will explain these things because it is very common practice to receive a letter. You might even see a letter that has a seal on the background, and it sounds scary. And a lot of times it's not an official notice. It's not a legal document. And like Antonio mentioned, without legal action, they cannot be evicted, not legally.
I want to get to some of our viewer questions. Elvira Connolly told us, she said that she rents in a co-op and that the board doesn't care if they have a COVID-related hardship or not. Are the rules different for co-ops than other rental situations?
If you live in a co-op apartment, you are not only the owner, but you're also a tenant at the same time because you have what is called a proprietary lease. So I would make the argument that because a co-op occupant is also a tenant, that they should be covered by Governor Cuomo's most recent order. However, it is always advisable for co-op owners or mortgage holders to contact an attorney and find out what their rights are.
And then Ronnie Smith echoed a sentiment that I've actually heard quite a bit. And the whole idea behind it is that if you cannot be evicted, some people may be considering not paying rent. Why is that such a big risk for them to take?
If you can't afford to pay the rent, and even if your rent burden is a little hard and high, and it's going to cause you some sort of financial hardship, you should make every effort to pay the rent. One of the reasons, of course, the most obvious one is that after the moratorium expires, we don't know what is going to happen. And also, even if you cannot get evicted for arrears that accrue during the pandemic or the so-called covered period, your credit can be actually highly affected, and that's not good. That's not something that you want. Also, landlords can always get a judgment, what is called a money judgment, and they can place a lien on your property, and they can also garnish your paychecks. So it's never a good idea to accrue those arrears. Everybody should make an effort to pay their monthly rent.
Even with the protections afforded by the CDC moratorium, there is fine print at the end that does advise tenants to make an effort to make payments according to what income they do have. So it does put a responsibility on tenants to make an effort to pay something according to whatever income they're getting, and then knowing that they will owe that rent or have to make a payment plan later in the future. So be it January 2021.
What do you tell people who really call you in a panic? What do you tell them to allay their fears and their concerns?
I always advise people, call 311, explain to them what your situation is, and they can always make referrals to programs like Home-Based, Catholic Charities, and others that are available in New York City. Tenants can call Catholic Charities at their helpline number, which is 888-744-7900.
Well, thank you, Larissa and Antonio, for joining us. We're going to put all of the information that they shared on our website at cbsnewyork.com.